They tried to drag the girl through the town until he stopped the horse. The sun stood high over the dusty main street when they tied the thin rope around the frightened girl's wrists and fastened the other end to the saddle horn without a single glance of mercy. And the town that should have protected her instead formed a loose, silent circle as she stumbled in the dirt with terror written across her pale face. She could not have been more than 17, her dress torn at the hem from being pulled through the street, her shoes long lost to the stones beneath her bare feet, and every breath she drew came sharp and uneven as she begged in a broken voice that barely carried over the restless snorting of the horse. The men who held the reins spoke in low, careless tones, as if they were discussing livestock instead of a trembling girl, accusing her of theft. She swore she had not committed, saying the punishment would teach others not to try the same. And the words drifted through the air like cold iron, heavy and final. She twisted her wrists again and again, despite the bite of the rope, her eyes searching the gathered faces for one kind look. One hand lifted in defense, one voice raised in protest, yet the crowd only shifted and murmured as fear kept their mouths sealed. The horse stamped impatiently, sensing tension in the air, and the man at its head tugged the reins forward just enough to make the girl stumble hard onto her knees, dust rising around her as she cried out in pain and panic. A woman in the crowd turned her face away, unable to watch, while a boy clutched his father's sleeve in confusion as the father stood rigid and silent, torn between what was right and what was safe. The girl tried to crawl toward the wooden steps of the store as if the town itself might still shelter her, but the rope snapped her backward with cruel ease, pulling her flat into the dirt again as the horse shifted its weight. Her sobs grew louder then, no longer apologies or explanations, but the raw sound of someone who knows she is about to be broken in front of strangers who will soon pretend they never saw. The man holding the reins lifted his hand, signaling the crowd to clear the path. And as the gathering slowly parted down the center of the street, the open road stretched before her like a sentence already spoken. She pressed her cheek into the dust and whispered for her mother, her shoulders shaking as the horse was turned into position, and the truth settled over the town like a shadow, that this was not justice being served, but fear being made into spectacle. And the first step of the horse forward marked the moment when silence became its own kind of cruelty. He had not meant to stop in the town at all, only to water his horse and ride on before the heat grew heavy. But the sound cut through the ordinary noise of the street and struck him raw, a girl's cry lifted thin with fear and disbelief. And when he turned toward it, the sight before him pulled his reins tight without thought or plan. He saw the rope, the horse, the way the crowd stood parted like a wound that would not close, and at the center of it all, the small figure of the girl in the dust, her hands bound, her shoulders trembling, as if her body itself did not yet believe what was being done to it. He sat still on his horse at the edge of the gathering, a tall figure shadowed by the brim of his hat, watching not as a hero yet, but as a man forced to witness what others pretended not to see. And in that moment, the old weight in his chest stirred again, the familiar ache of knowing too well how quickly a town could turn fear into law and cruelty into example. He studied the faces around her, the hard eyes of the men at the reins, the averted gazes of those who would not meet the girl's terror with their own courage. And he felt the same quiet bitterness that had followed him across more miles than he cared to remember, the knowledge that a crowd could be more dangerous than any single hand raised in violence. The horse stepped once more at the urging of the man who held it, and the girl was dragged a short distance forward on her knees, her cry rising higher now, sharp with pain, and the sound carried through him like a spur, cutting past the careful distance he had learned to keep from other people's troubles. Still, he did not move yet, because memory spoke just as loudly as conscience, reminding him how stepping into the wrong moment had once cost him nearly everything, reminding him that men like him were rarely welcomed as defenders and often made into scapegoats instead. He watched the sheriff near the steps of the jail, rigid and unmoving, his face turned just enough to show conflict without action. And in that small detail, he saw the truth fully take shape, that no order would come from authority and no rescue from the law, that if the rope was to be stopped, it would not be by command, but by choice. The girl tried again to speak, her voice barely holding steady as she cried that she had done nothing wrong, that she only brought water from the river, as she did every day, and the simplicity of the words cut deeper than any plea for mercy, because they carried no argument, only fact. Yet even that was brushed aside by the muttered approval of a few who stood too safely away to feel the rope bite. The man at the reins drew his arm back and flicked the rope as a warning to clear the last of the path, and the crowd obeyed him now with shameful ease, stepping aside and leaving the girl surrounded not by people, but by distance. It was then that the stillness in the watching stranger broke, not in sudden fury, but in quiet decision, as he leaned forward in his saddle and let his hand fall lower along his reins, his eyes fixed not on the men, but on the rope itself, measuring the space between watching and acting, knowing already that once he crossed it, there would be no return to the road he had intended to take. The horse surged forward at last, not into a full run, but into that first cruel pull that steals balance and breath together, and the girl was dragged a short span through the dust before the stranger moved, his decision snapping into motion as cleanly as a drawn line. He drove his horse hard through the edge of the crowd, the sudden force scattering bodies that had moments before stood frozen in witness. And before the man at the reins could fully turn in surprise, the stranger leaned low from his saddle and reached for the rope with both hands, his fingers closing tight around the coarse fibers as they burned against his palms. The horse lunged again, confused by the sudden resistance, and the rope went taut between them, jerking the stranger's arm nearly from its socket but not breaking his grip, and the girl was yanked sideways instead of forward, rolling hard across the dirt with a cry that tore through the street. The man at the reins shouted in anger and lashed the rope once toward the stranger's hands, but the blow glanced wide as the stranger hauled backward with all the weight of his body and the strength of his horse behind him, the fibers straining until with a sharp crack, the loop came free from the saddle horn and flew slack between them. The girl lay still for a heartbeat, stunned and coughing, and the stranger did not hesitate for that single breath, driving his horse forward again to place his body between her and the men as he tossed the severed rope aside. The crowd erupted into noise then, not cheers, but startled voices spilling from the fear that had been dammed inside them. And the man who had held the reins rushed forward with his fists raised, only to halt short at the sight of the stranger's steady gaze beneath the brim of his hat, a gaze that promised consequence without needing to announce it. The sheriff took one step down from the jail platform and then stopped, his mouth opened as if to speak, but no order finding its way out, as though the words he owned no longer belonged to him. The stranger swung down from his saddle and knelt beside the girl at once, cutting the rope from her wrists with one swift motion and easing her upright with a careful hand at her back as she gasped and trembled in his hold, her fear so deep that she flinched even from rescue, He told her quietly that the horse could not touch her now, that she was free, and as the meaning of the words reached her, her body sagged into sobbing relief against his arm. The men who had accused her surged forward again in protest, shouting that she would be punished yet, that theft could not go unanswered. But the stranger turned to face them fully then, standing tall with the girl shielded behind him, and told them in a voice even and low that a lie did not become law simply because it found a crowd to echo it. The street fell into a tense hush as the moment reshaped itself, the rope no longer a tool of fear, but a discarded thing in the dust, and the girl alive, unbroken, and no longer alone, where moments before she had been condemned in silence. They moved her from the street quickly once the noise began to swell again, not with haste born of fear, but with the quiet urgency of those who understand how fragile safety can be when a crowd is stirred, and the stranger guided the trembling girl toward the small feed store at the edge of town, while the sheriff finally found his voice to order the people back into their places, his words carrying less authority than before, but enough to open a narrow path. Inside the dim shelter of the store, the heat dropped into a cooler hush, and the stranger eased her down onto a sack of grain, while the owner, pale and shaken, brought water without needing to be asked, his hands unsteady as he held the cup to her lips. She drank in short, desperate sips, coughing once before the water settled, and with each breath that steadied her shoulders fell a little lower from their rigid fear. The stranger knelt near her, not as a guard now, but as a quiet presence, telling her the rope was gone, that no horse waited outside for her, and though she nodded, she did so as one who had not yet learned how to trust that the world had changed in her favor. The store owner fetched a clean cloth and pressed it into her hands for the raw skin at her wrists, and when she looked down at the marks left behind by the rope, her breath caught again, the reality of what had nearly happened pushing fresh tears into her eyes. The stranger did not speak then, knowing some moments required no words, only steadiness, and he remained close enough that she could lean toward him without touching. When her fear surged again. Outside, the murmur of the town drifted through the thin walls in broken pieces, voices arguing, questions rising, shame finding its way into sound at last where silence had ruled before, and the sheriff's boots paced once past the door and then back again, as if he searched for a way to step into the moment without knowing how. The girl's sobs softened gradually into quiet, shaking breaths, and when she finally lifted her eyes to the stranger, she studied his face with the hesitant wonder of someone trying to understand why a life had been spared by a person she had never seen before. And in a small voice she asked if he would leave once the town settled. He answered her truthfully that he had planned to ride on before all of this, but plans were light things compared to the weight of what had just passed between her and the dust. And he told her he would not ride until he was certain she would not be taken again. That promise settled into her with visible relief, and she nodded slowly as though testing the truth of it before believing. The store owner laid a blanket over her shoulders despite the warmth of the day, not for cold, but for cover. And when she pulled it close, the simple act felt like the first kindness she had been given in longer than she could measure. Beyond the door, the town continued to shift uneasily around the shape of what it had almost allowed. But inside the feed store, the girl rested at last in a pocket of shelter shaped not by walls alone, but by the quiet courage that had lifted her from the path of a moving horse and set her back among the living. The town's heat drifted slowly past the open door of the feed store, but inside, the air felt steadier as the girl's breathing finally evened. And when the stranger shifted his weight to ease the stiffness from his knees, She followed the movement with cautious eyes, as though afraid he might vanish if she looked away for too long. He remained where he was, resting one arm on his thigh, giving her space without retreating from it. And after a while, she whispered her name for the first time since the rope had touched her skin. The sound so soft it almost slipped beneath the low murmur outside. He answered with his own name in return, not as a declaration, but as an offering of equal ground, and the exchange settled something between them that fear had kept suspended. She told him haltingly that she lived with her aunt, who took in washing at the river, that she had gone for water the way she always did, and returned to find men waiting with a story already shaped against her, and that nothing she said after that had seemed to matter, her words folding in on themselves beneath louder voices. He listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, and when she faltered, he waited, understanding that truth sometimes needed silence to find its next step. She asked him then why he had stepped forward when the whole town had stepped back, and the question carried both gratitude and disbelief, for she was still learning how to place meaning on what had been done for her. He did not answer with hero's words or claims of right and wrong, only told her that he had once been condemned by a crowd that knew only a fragment of his life and had nearly lost everything to a judgment that never paused to ask who he truly was, and that when he saw the rope pulled tight, he recognized the same hunger for an easy enemy that had once turned on him. Her eyes widened slightly at that, not in alarm, but in understanding. And for the first time since the street, she leaned toward him instead of shrinking away, drawn by the knowledge that he knew her fear from the inside. The store owner returned with bread and pressed it into her hands without ceremony, and she ate slowly, as if testing whether simple needs were permitted again. And when she dropped a small piece of crust in sudden clumsiness brought on by shaking hands, the stranger bent to retrieve it without comment, placing it back beside her in a gesture so ordinary it quietly carried more kindness than any speech might have. Outside, voices rose and fell as the town argued with itself. But inside, a fragile trust began to take root between a rescued girl and the man who had taken hold of her fate with burning hands, and in that shared stillness she no longer looked at him as a stranger alone, but as someone bound to her by the simple truth that neither of them had been believed when belief mattered most. The argument outside the feed store sharpened as the afternoon wore on, voices no longer hushed by shock, but fueled by pride and wounded certainty. And the stranger heard the change in their tone, even before the sheriff appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hands and a weight on his shoulders that had not been there before. He spoke first to the store owner, asking that the girl be brought outside so the matter could be settled in the open, and when the girl flinched at the word settled, the stranger laid a steady hand on the edge of the sack beside her and told her quietly that he would not let her stand alone again. The sheriff waited with visible effort to keep his voice calm as they stepped into the street together, the crowd parting now with uneasy respect rather than ease. And the men who had accused the girl stood near the horse with their arms folded in stubborn insistence. The sheriff asked for the charge to be stated clearly, and when one of the men claimed she had stolen silver from a passing trader, the words rang hollow even as they were spoken, thin with the strain of being repeated without proof. The girl lifted her chin with trembling resolve and said she had never seen such silver, that she carried only water and laundry between the river and her aunt's home. And the stranger felt the moment stretch thin as the town weighed which story it would choose to hold. The sheriff turned then to the accusers and demanded witness or evidence, something more than heat and anger. And as they stumbled through excuses and half-formed claims, another voice rose from the back of the gathering, the traitor himself stepping forward at last, with a scowl that faltered when every eye turned upon him. He admitted reluctantly that his silver had gone missing earlier that morning while he drank at the far end of town, and though he could not say who took it, he had pointed at the girl because she had passed by his wagon afterward, and fear had done the rest. A murmur rippled through the street, not in protest now, but in doubt, and the sheriff's gaze hardened as he looked from the traitor to the men who had already chosen punishment without proof. He spoke then that fear was not law and accusation was not truth, and though his words carried authority, they did not carry peace, for shame does not easily release those who have acted in haste. The stranger felt the tension settle deeper rather than lift, sensing that while the rope had been stopped, the threat had only changed its shape. For a town embarrassed is as dangerous as a town enraged. And as the sheriff dismissed the crowd, one uneasy step at a time, the stranger knew the girl was not yet free of the harm that false judgment had already cast upon her name. The street emptied slowly after the sheriff's words dispersed the crowd, but the girl felt no sudden release in the space left behind, only the quiet weight of eyes that had judged her once and might do so again in softer ways. And as she walked beside the stranger toward her aunt's small home near the river, each step felt uncertain, as if the ground itself no longer trusted her. He walked with her at an easy distance, close enough to be present without pressing into her fear, and she sensed in that space the careful balance he was trying to hold between protection and respect. When they reached the narrow porch, her aunt stood frozen in the doorway with a hand braced against the frame, her face lined with relief and lingering dread as she pulled the girl into her arms without words, holding her as if the rope had never left her wrists. The stranger watched from the yard, prepared to turn away now that the girl was returned to the place that claimed her, but she found herself breaking free of the embrace with a sudden urgency and stepping back onto the porch to call after him, asking if he would stay at least until the night fell, for the town felt too wide and uncertain to face alone just yet. He hesitated, surprise flickering across his features, for he had learned to move when his part was done, not to linger where his presence complicated fragile peace. And in that pause he felt the familiar pull between walking on and standing still for someone who had already lost enough. The aunt studied him carefully from the doorway, measuring him not as a stranger, but as the man who had pulled her niece from the path of a moving horse. And though every instinct urged caution, she nodded once with quiet trust, giving him permission without asking his story. As evening settled, the girl sat near the window and watched the street from behind the safety of glass, the sounds of ordinary life resuming outside with a gentleness that felt almost unreal, and she confessed in a low voice that she feared the town would remember only the accusation and not the truth, that whispers would follow her through every doorway as they had followed the rope into the street. The stranger listened and told her that scars could not be erased by a single day, but they could be answered by steady days that followed. And though his words were simple, they carried the weight of one who had lived long enough to know the cost of waiting for judgment to fade. She asked him then if he planned to leave at first light, and the question was not possessive, but uncertain, shaped by the fear of once again facing the world without someone willing to stand between her and its cruelty. He answered honestly that he did not yet know, that the road still pulled at him, even as the memory of her cry tugged him back toward this place. And in that admission, they shared a quiet understanding that neither of them stood at the same place they had occupied that morning. When the sun finally lowered into the river's glow, the girl felt the tension of the day settle into something heavier but steadier than panic. and she understood that courage was no longer only the stranger's burden to carry. For whatever tomorrow brought, she would have to choose again how to walk beneath the eyes of those who had once turned away. Night came quietly to the riverbank homes, but the calm it brought was thin and fragile, and the stranger felt the shift in the air before the trouble took shape in sound. The distant rise of voices carried across the water like a warning, pushed ahead of its cause. He stepped out onto the narrow porch where the girl and her aunt now stood together, and in the faint lantern light he saw fear return to the girl's face before she spoke it, telling him the men who had accused her were gathering again near the far end of the street. Their anger sharpened by the sheriff's dismissal and the humiliation of being publicly questioned. The stranger listened without interrupting, understanding that the threat had never truly left, only retreated until its pride demanded another answer. And he knew then that this night would not be decided by law or crowd, but by the quiet line that one man chose to hold when fear came searching for another voice to hide behind. He told the girl's aunt to bar the door and keep the lights low, and when she objected that he did not owe them more than he had already given, he answered her simply that some debts are chosen and not counted. And with that, he lifted his hat from the peg by the door and stepped back into the dark. The street beyond had thickened with shadow, and as he walked toward the sound of hard voices and restless movement, the memory of the girl's cry followed him like a hand at his back, pressing him onward, not in anger, but in resolve. The men stood near the river road now, gathered in tense knots, their words sharp with wounded pride as they spoke of being made fools before the town, and of how such things could not be left unanswered. And when they saw him approach, the tone shifted from complaint to threat with uneasy speed. He stopped a short distance from them and told them that the matter was finished, that false accusation had no right to become punishment simply because it was embarrassed. And when one man laughed bitterly and spoke of teaching lessons, the law would not. The stranger felt the final shape of the danger settle into place. He did not reach for a weapon, did not step back or forward too quickly, but stood as he had in the daylight with his hands visible and his voice steady, telling them that if they sought to stain the night with what they had failed to complete in the sun, then they would have to pass through him first. The words were neither boast nor challenge, only boundary, and the men felt it as such, their anger finding no easy path around the calm thread of consequence laid plainly before them. After a long, uncertain stretch of silence, one man spat into the dirt and turned away, and the others followed in uneasy retreat, their need for vengeance dulled by the sobering truth that cruelty thrives best when no one is willing to stand in front of it. And as their footsteps faded into the dark, the stranger remained where he was until the night settled again, knowing the risk he had taken could not be measured in wounds alone, but in the choice to be seen once more as the shield between fear and innocence. Morning returned the town to itself with deceptive ease, sunlight washing the street as if nothing violent had ever waited there the day before. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds of doors opening and buckets drawing water, a quieter reckoning moved through those who had watched and said nothing. The sheriff stood before the jail with a small gathered crowd and called the men who had made the accusation forward, his voice firm without needing to rise. And when they stepped out under the open sky, their confidence of the previous day had thinned into uncertainty. The traitor was brought as well, his face tight as he repeated his claim of loss. And this time, the sheriff pressed him harder, asking when his silver had last been seen, who had been with him, and what proof he carried besides suspicion. And as the questions stacked one upon another, the truth that had been hidden beneath haste began to fracture. A stable hand spoke at last that he had seen another man near the trader's wagon during the hour in question, a man known for drift and small theft, and the murmur that followed no longer leaned toward punishment, but toward understanding. The town beginning to feel the weight of what it had almost done in the name of fear. The sheriff turned then to the girl and asked her to speak, not as an accused, but as a witness to her own life. And though her hands trembled, she told the simple story of water drawn and laundry carried, of returning to find the rope where kindness should have been, and when she finished, no voice rose to deny her words. The stranger stood among the listeners now, rather than apart from them, and when the sheriff met his eyes, there was no challenge between them, only a shared knowledge that the town had been brought to a place it could not pretend away. With authority finally guided by truth, the sheriff dismissed the charge against the girl and warned the others that no claiming of justice without proof would ever again be tolerated while he bore the badge, and the sentence landed not with cheers, but with bowed heads and quiet assent. The men who had accused her did not apologize aloud, but as they turned away, their shoulders sagged beneath the recognition that silence had nearly made them executioners, and that knowledge would follow them longer than any rebuke. When the gathering dispersed, the sheriff stepped toward the stranger and thanked him not for stopping the rope, but for stopping the town when it could not stop itself. And in that rare moment of openness between law and outsider, there was no rivalry left to stand between them. The girl approached then with careful steps and stood beside the stranger in plain sight of all who watched, and in that simple act of choosing where to stand, justice took its final form not as punishment given, but as truth finally shared in the open. The town found its quieter rhythm again in the days that followed, but this time the calm settled with a different weight than before, as if the street itself remembered what had nearly been done upon it and chose to tread more carefully because of it. And the girl felt that change first not in the faces that passed her on the road, but in the way she walked beneath them, her steps steadier now, her eyes no longer cast to the ground as though she must shrink beneath every glance. She returned to the river each morning with her aunt for water and washing, and though whispers still moved at the edge of hearing, they no longer carried the power to bend her posture. For truth had been spoken once in the open and could not be fully buried again. The stranger remained a few days longer than he had ever intended, helping repair a broken fence near the river road, sharing bread at the small table in the aunt's home, and speaking little of himself beyond what was needed for the quiet understanding that had grown between them, a bond shaped not by promises but by shared memory of how easily the world could turn. The girl watched him from the doorway on the morning he finally saddled his horse to leave, the ache of parting held gently in her chest without the sharp panic that had once ruled her. And when he stepped closer to her before mounting, he told her that what had been taken from her in the street could not be fully returned by words or time, but that what she had discovered in herself would remain longer than any wound left by rope or fear. She thanked him not with tears, but with the steady look of someone who had learned to hold gratitude without trembling beneath it, and her aunt pressed a small bundle of food into his hands as if sending off a son rather than a passing stranger. And he accepted it with a nod that carried more meaning than any farewell speech could manage. As he rode out of town along the river road, no one blocked his path, and no shadow followed close behind, and the girl stood where she could see the open stretch of water beyond the trees, understanding that some rescues were not meant to end with return, but with release. Life resumed its ordinary shape with small changes that mattered deeply. Laughter at the washing lines that had once been hushed, neighbors greeting one another with fewer guarded glances, and the sheriff walking the street with a quieter authority that listened as often as it commanded. The girl still felt the memory of the rope some nights when sleep came slowly, yet she also felt the stronger memory of hands that had cut her free, and a voice that had stood calm in the face of fear. And those memories rose together, now not as pain, but as proof. By the time summer leaned fully into the river grass, and the dust settled into a gentler pattern along the street, she no longer thought of herself as the girl who had been dragged through the town, but as the young woman who had walked back through it with her name restored. And in that steady reclaiming of her place, she found a future shaped not by what had nearly destroyed her, but by what had risen to save her. Sometimes courage arrives on horseback, and sometimes it rises quietly from within. Thank you for staying with this story of fear turned into strength. May your own path always lead away from cruelty and toward peace.